Welcome to this Open University podcast on the OU's OpenSTEM Labs. I'm Martin Cousins and I'll be hosting this panel discussion in which we will be taking a look at what the OU OpenSTEM Labs are, how they work, and how educators can use them to enhance the learning experience for their students. Joining me today are Dr. Helen Lockett, Director of the OpenSTEM Labs.
Hello.
Kevin Gowans, Senior Manager at the OpenSTEM Labs.
Hello.
And Dr. Mark Hurst, a Senior Lecturer in Biology.
Hello.
And now I'd like to turn to you first, Helen, to find out about the labs. Can I start by asking you to tell us what they are and who they are for?
So the OpenSTEM Labs are the way we deliver practical learning to distance learning students at the Open University. Because it's a distance learning module, our students can't go into the laboratory the way they would in a conventional university. So we've had to develop ways for students to undertake practical learning from home. And in the past, in the early days of the Open University, we would have sent home experiment kits. So we would have sent a chemistry set or electronics experiments for students to do at home. And as technology has developed, we've moved towards using online and remote laboratories through the OpenSTEM Labs. So they've developed for our Open University students, and that's our primary purpose, to deliver practical learning for Open University students. But of course, we want to open up those activities as far as we can to other people as well. So we have some activities that are available for free to the general public. And what we're talking about today is some activities that can be licensed by other organisations.
So why were they developed?
So as I said, for distance learning students, they can't come into the laboratory and undertake the activities in a face-to-face mode because our students are all over the country and many of them are working, so they aren't available in working hours when we'd be able to offer labs. So we needed to come up with a way that students could get that practical learning experience that's so very important in STEM subjects, but without having to come into the laboratory. So the OpenSTEM Labs allow our students to undertake their learning in a place that's convenient to them. They can do it at home. All they need is a web browser on a laptop or a mobile device to access the activities. And
why are they important and interesting for educators right now?
Well, of course, this year with the COVID-19 pandemic, all universities have faced the challenges that we've faced for a long time of how do you allow students to engage in practical learning without them coming into a laboratory. So we've had a huge number of inquiries this year from universities asking us if we can help them to overcome the challenges that they have, bringing in our experience, which we've had over a long period of time. I think organisations are also recognising beyond the pandemic that there are real benefits to having remote laboratories anyway. It gives students more flexibility on when they study, they can repeat activities if they need to improve their understanding, and it can give you better use of your equipment for remote experiments because the equipment can be available maybe 24 hours a day.
Yeah. And what's the history of these labs? How long have they been around?
Well, they've grown organically over about a 10-year period, and they started largely in the science area. We had some funding from the Wolfson Foundation about 10 years ago to develop what we called then the Open Science Lab, which is now one wing of our broader OpenSTEM Lab. And then it expanded into engineering in about 2015, where we had funding from the Higher Education Funding Council for England. And we're always working to develop new innovations and create new activities across different curriculum areas in our STEM faculty.
Yeah, so I mean, you kind of touched on this a bit, but what types of activities do you have in the labs?
So it's probably worth starting by saying we have two main types of activities. We have remote experiments where students are engaging with real equipment from their laptop browser. And then we have on-screen activities where students are engaging usually with real data, but through a sort of simulated virtual environment. So maybe to give a couple of examples of remote experiments, we have some open science observatories. So that's two telescopes sitting on the island of Tenerife, which is one of the best observing locations in the world. And students can connect to those telescopes from home. They can choose where to observe in the sky, and then they can download imaging that they can analyse afterwards. Similarly, we have for electronics students, the students can connect to real equipment sitting in our labs on the Open University campus and control the electronics equipment and watch what's going on through a live video feed. So those are examples of remote experiments where there's real equipment. And then we also have on-screen activities, which are more what we're talking about today. And they allow students to engage with practical learning using real data, but they don't rely on having physical equipment. So of course the benefit of that is that it's much easier to scale the activities up to large numbers of students without having to buy vast amounts of equipment. So maybe to give you one simple example, we have virtual microscopes. So the students are using a virtual environment to look at a scanned microscope slide, but they have all of the controls they would have on a real microscope, so they can set the magnification and the focus and so on.
Wow. So, and are the OpenSTEM labs something that other organisations can access and use?
So yes, as I said, that this year we've had a lot of interest in using the OpenSTEM labs externally. We offer access through a number of different ways. So some of our activities are available for free. Some of them have been set up that way from the beginning. So an example would be the virtual microscope that I mentioned. Mm-hmm. Some of the activities are available through some of our free learning materials at the Open University. So we have an Open Learn platform where people can register free for courses. And if anyone was interested in using the Open Science Observatory, you can do that using an Open Learn course. And what we've done this year is develop a licensed offering that will allow other universities to purchase our activities to use with their own students. So initially, we're just offering a limited number of activities in the area of chemistry, biology, life sciences, but we do hope to offer more activities soon. And all of those are activities are the on-screen type activities, and they can be run locally on the university's virtual learning environment, allowing them to integrate that learning with their other teaching materials.
Mm-hmm. That's really interesting, Helen, and thank you for those insights. Now I'm going to turn to Dr. Mark Hurst to look at how the labs are being used by organisations outside of the OU. Mark, can you give us some examples of what they help teach and how they might be used?
So things like the interactive screen experiments are principally designed around emphasizing particular aspects of different types of experimental approaches across the entire areas of STEM. Mm-hmm. They're often built into different types of active ways in which students are engaging. For example, Helen just mentioned the microscope. It's a great tool to allow students to explore a subject, learning how to use controls, but they, generally speaking, they can be used to deliver a range of different types of learning outcomes. Most of the experiments have got different controls so that students can play around with variables and see how different variables influence an outcome of an experiment. A lot have got sources of variability built into the data so that students can get an appreciation for both the variability that's intrinsic to data and also how that may be influenced by the instrument being used, for example. They're usually intrinsically designed around allowing students to explore some of the understanding of the core concepts of a subject. Coming back to the microscope, it's often used in biology not only as a practical tool, but to allow students to understand structures of cells and structures of tissues. So it works to reinforce the core learning in any type of teaching. There's also the aspect that it teaches some of the functionality of an instrument. So we'll have instruments, for example, which collect data using particular wavelengths where you have to adjust particular factors. And also built into the experiments are teaching students how to use particular aspects of experimental design, experimental controls, experimental replicates. So it actually works across a whole range of areas that you would teach normally in a traditional laboratory setting. Of course, what you get on top of that is the experience of one-screen working skills in terms of collecting numbers, handling those numbers downstream in things like spreadsheets and graphing tools. But you're also indirectly developing skills, things like observation, data recording and data management. So they can be used to teach a whole range of things that you would normally be teaching in a traditional face-to-face university environment.
Mm-hmm. And so how might they be used in teaching?
Well, at the Open University, we blend them together with a whole range of different types of materials, some of it online, some of it in book material. So they actually can be used in different types of environments. So alongside and integrating with existing things like lectures, video materials, running tutorials and those types of things is what you'd expect them to be very useful to do. Mm-hmm. But you can also wrap them around traditional laboratory work. They're very good sometimes at preparing a student before they attend a laboratory, for example, but also once the student has been in a laboratory, for example, you may want a student to learn how to use a microscope. Then they can explore at their own pace, so they can be used to supplement or extend laboratory studies. For example, taking students on to do things like project courses. The other thing they're also very useful for is providing students with access to resources that normally aren't usable by undergraduates. Things like either very rare resources, like unusual biological collections of slides, even things like animal experimentation, or tissues, for example, are quite commonly used in biology. They're often difficult to produce for undergraduate classes. And you also get the advantage that you can, in some cases, reduce timescales. So timescales of experiments that may last days or weeks can actually be reduced so that students can grapple with much longer or much more complex types of experiments. Mm-hmm. I think Helen also mentioned the fact that we have the ability to access high-end laboratory equipment, things like much more expensive electron microscopes and things like that. So they can also provide students with those types of resources. And of course, they're available 24/7, which means that they're great for remote use because they're accessed over the internet. But also they can be asynchronous. So students can study at their own pace. They can go back and repeat things. Those are things that are often not possible in a traditional laboratory setting. So they have many, many uses, and I think most undergraduate teaching would be able to slot them into what would be their traditional learning packages.
Excellent. And do you have any examples of the labs, a real example of how they're being used?
A couple of examples which stand out. One, for example, is a virtual lab training for laboratory rats. Training of rats using laboratory animals is very difficult to access because of ethics and safety reasons. But it's very common in behavioral sciences to look after rats over a period of time and train them to respond to certain types of behaviors, primarily using food. So, for example, virtual lab training effectively allows students to work their way through a set of experiments and manipulate a few variables over a period of 7 days. You could never do that in a face-to-face environment, laboratory-wise, but it allows students to engage with these quite complex sort of tasks. What I should say is this gives incredibly good feedback from students, particularly because it really helps develop their record-keeping skills. They have to maintain records over a long period of time, mm-hmm. and also interpret the behavioral data they get from it. So that's one example where it's replacing something that most students wouldn't do.
Yeah.
If you were to look at an analytical instrument, a very good example is a very commonly used technique in biosciences and chemistry, which is HPLC. The interfaces we use very much mirror what a student would see in a laboratory, but very few students would get to use these types of instruments beyond potentially a final year project type of student. But the types of interfaces we design allow students to control experimental variables, investigate the data, and actually analyze quite complex samples. In the case I think you're seeing on screen, they're analyzing serum samples to detect differences in the way in which drugs are metabolized. And in this case, they can then go back and set that within the context of understanding about the biochemistry and the biology of the system and cells they're looking at. So those are two good examples.
And I believe you also have an example that's very of the moment.
Well, particularly in biosciences, there's a test that's very commonly used in any type of diagnostics called the polymerase chain reaction, or PCR test. Mm-hmm. It's probably in the news more than anything at the moment because of COVID PCR testing. Mm-hmm. There is an interface we have, an on-screen experiment, which allows students to apply this technique not in a diagnostics context, but actually relate to the drug metabolism they've analyzed in HPLC, allowing them to join up two different analytical techniques. In this case, the interface allows you to detect amplification of different gene sequences, and in this case, it's looking at multiple populations, so the students are recording very large data sets and having to manage them using spreadsheets, and also do a genetic interpretation. And we can design experiments so that the students can measure drugs using HPLC and analyze the genetics using PCR and bring the two things together. That would be very unusual in a traditional university setting, because those laboratory experiments would never really be brought together. So you bring together some interesting approaches and interesting techniques to allow just to enhance a student's understanding.
Fantastic. Thanks, Mark. And finally, I'd like to bring in Kevin Gowans to take a closer look at how the labs work. Now, Kevin, how are OpenSTEM Labs being used by external organisations at the moment?
Currently, we predominantly engage with other higher education institutions who've actually identified a need in their curriculum delivery, but do not necessarily have the capabilities or capacities to actually develop the in-house solutions. So there are two ways we can help them on this. Firstly, that they host it in their own virtual environments, as this offer is very much about. And this has various advantages. So, for example, it can seamlessly integrate into their own curriculum. Students don't have to go to an external site. They can use the organisation's branding, and they can also make use of any of the analytics that their own systems produces to aid their student performance measures. I think it's also important here to note that as part of the discovery process, the organisations can try before they fully commit. In this, I mean staff can try the experiments on the Open University system, but when they're ready to use it on their own system, there is also this grace period whereby the organisation can upload the experiments to ensure that they actually work correctly under their own system environments. The other alternative we have, and we've done this for one organisation, two organisations now, is that we could maybe host those experiments under our own system, and that's either on a temporary or a permanent basis. Obviously, this option doesn't give the advantages of their own on-site hosting, but it may actually help where the integration timescales are actually too short and they need that quick fix.
And what are the benefits of using OpenSTEM Labs as a part of the learning mix?
Leading on from the last question, I think one is that they provide an alternative to organisations. They don't have to either have the capacity or capabilities to develop and implement their own remote experiments, or maybe not the desire to. And this, again, as I said before, this is particularly relevant when timescales are actually tight. Mm-hmm. The other one is, of course, as both Mark and Helen have talked about, these have been developed along with our own curriculum. They're actually used by our own students. So an organisation can be confident that they've been fully tested and fit for purpose.
And how do OpenSTEM Labs fit into the broader OU learning offering for external organisations?
Well, traditionally, we seem to think of licensing of course materials such as books, audio, visual elements, and the like. But of course, as both, again, Helen and Mark have shown, the OpenSTEM Labs extends that offer into the practical and experimental dimension of the learning experience. And this can be particularly useful for organisations also that don't necessarily have the lab capacity at the time, whether it's they don't have the labs or they don't have enough of them.
Now, and can external users access any other OpenSTEM Lab activities?
Oh, yeah, yes, indeed. And we do actually welcome inquiries. The labs have many experiments available, both the on-screen activities and, as Helen mentioned, the remote equipment. The offer only shows part of that system that we've got and the number of experiments, and it particularly doesn't show the remote equipment side of our offer. So using the remote equipment, students can connect to, control, receive data from actually real pieces of equipment, and as has been shown, these are on a scale from desktop equipment, electronics, could be computing equipment, up to the sort of size of the telescopes we have on a mountain in Tenerife. And again, these are all controlled through the browser, all in real time.
That's great.
Yeah.
So my final question is, where can organisations find out more about OpenSTEM Labs?
There are several ways you can get further information about these, and the context should be now showing on the screen.
That's great, Kevin, and that brings our discussion to a close. I'd like to thank our panel for all your fantastic insights and for bringing the OU's OpenSTEM Labs to life. Thank you. Thank you for listening. To find out more about how the OU works with businesses, go to open.ac.uk/business.